don't say, oh, I just have to suck it up. Go talk to your priest. Talk to men and women in your life who are wise, and especially those who had gone through communism, and ask them, what is the prudent thing to do? We can't go out every time we get the least little bit of trouble and make a tough stand. We have to be prudent. But if there's no line where you will not surrender your job or your position in society for the sake of the truth, then you're already captured.
Thank you so much for tuning into the Signal Sitdown, but before we get to the interview, we'd love it if you'd hit that like and subscribe button on YouTube, Spotify, or wherever you may be joining us. And please remember to give us a 5-star review because we love your feedback. Remember, it's your government, and together we'll expose how it really works and how to affect real change. Without further ado, here's the interview. Rod Dreher, welcome to the Signal Sitdown.
Glad to be here, Bradley. Thanks for having me.
It feels like, we've corresponded with each other for years over email because we were colleagues at one point, and then we would see each other in the most extreme circumstances, whether it was at a conference in DC or in Florida or in London or in Budapest. All over the world, it seems like we've run into each other. And we're here to talk about this, Live Not by Lies, the book that's about to not be a book
Not
anymore.
just a book anymore.
Not just a book anymore. We were recording this the day before the first part in this docu-series premieres.
Right.
So first, tell us a little bit about the project before we get into the contents.
Sure. Well, back in 2015, I was writing for the American Conservative. I had a blog there, and I got a call from a doctor in the Midwest who had reached out to me through a mutual friend. He said, I have to tell somebody what's going on. What? He said his elderly mother, who lived with him and his wife, had been a political prisoner in communist Czechoslovakia in the 1950s. They imprisoned her, the communists did, because she was a spy for the Vatican, meaning she wouldn't stop going to church when they told her to. After she got out, she immigrated to America and started a family here. But in 2015, she told her son, the things I see happening in this country, the United States, remind me of what it was like when the communists first came to power in Czechoslovakia. And what she was talking about was the Great Awakening, what we now call the Great Awakening, people losing their jobs because of what they say, losing their businesses and so forth. I thought it was a little extreme at first, but the more I started talking to people when I would go to conferences or travel, people who had come to America to escape Soviet communism, I would just ask them, do you see parallels to what you left behind? Bradley, every single one of them said yes. And if you talk to them long enough, they would get really angry that Americans didn't take them seriously. So that was the genesis for Live Not by Lies. The title is from Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn, his last communique to his followers in the Soviet Union before they expelled him to the West in 1974. What I do in the book, the first half, is trying to explain what I call soft totalitarianism, the thing that we're living through now or is rising now. Hopefully it's being pushed back some, but explaining how that differs from the Soviet version, the hard version. And the second half of the book is based on a bunch of interviews I did over in the former Eastern Bloc countries with people, mostly Christians, who had stayed behind and resisted. I was seeking out their advice for how we should see our own situation under very different material and political circumstances, but that is nevertheless incipiently totalitarian. Book came out in 2020, right in the middle of COVID. It was completely ignored by the mainstream media, which had not happened to my books before. But you can see why when I'm talking about the way the government and institutions like media, academia are using race and all of that to suppress truth and the discussion of truth. You can see why they ignored it. But the book ended up selling over 200,000 copies, mostly by podcast and word of mouth. And now Angel Studios has produced a 4-part docu-series. It's going to, as you said, it'll be airing throughout the month of April, a new episode each Tuesday, in which we went and talked to some of the very people in the book. You get to see their faces and hear their voices making the same argument, trying to wake people in the West up to the threats to our liberty that come from believing lies.
Mm-hmm. And what does it mean to live not by lies? I know that you took it from Solzhenitsyn,
right.
But in this moment, it feels like, as you said, there is a public-private partnership against the truth.
Yeah.
So what these folks that you talk to, their stories, when they tell you what they went through in these communist regimes and these communist governments, or their family had gone through, what was your takeaway? How do you not live by lies?
Yeah. Well, the Solzhenitsyn short essay from which I took the title was when Solzhenitsyn told his followers in Russia, he said, look, we can't expect to overthrow this government, and it would be foolish to go stand in the middle of Red Square with a bullhorn and call for the overthrow of the government. So what can we do? Well, there are small things every one of us can do. He said we have to live not by lies. What he meant by that was, do not sign a piece of paper, a petition or something that you don't believe in. Don't read newspapers where you know that they're nothing but lies. Don't participate in public meetings where the truth can't be spoken, and so on and so forth. This small dissent from the ruling class narrative undermines the regime ultimately, and at least it gives you the dignity of knowing that you may have power, the Soviets, you may have power, but not with my consent. Václav Havel was also a well-known dissident from the communists and later became the first president of a free Czechoslovakia. He said something very similar in 1977, 3 years after Solzhenitsyn, in a book-length essay he wrote called The Power of the Powerless. He was talking about what people who have no political power can actually do under totalitarianism. And he made the same argument. He said that he created what's now called Havel's greengrocer. It was a fable. He said, imagine there's a greengrocer living in a communist city, and like everybody else who owns a business there, he has to put a sign in his window saying, "Workers of the world, unite," the Marxist slogan. Nobody believes it. They all put the sign there to avoid trouble. One day, the greengrocer takes the sign down. What happens to him? Well, he gets arrested. They take his business. He has to sweep streets for a living. His kids can't go to college, et cetera, et cetera. He pays a real price for standing up for the truth. But what does he gain? First of all, he gains his integrity, and he shows everybody who sees this that it is possible to live in truth, to live with dignity, if you are willing to suffer for it. And over time, said Havel, if enough people do that, then this entire system built on lies will collapse. So what does that mean for us? In the book, I talk about, and again, this came out in 2020, I talk about DEI. I talk about, resisting wokeness, refusing to accept these lies out of fear of losing our status. That is the best way we can do it, and we can educate ourselves, educate our children as to what the lies that run our society are. Another thing that's so interesting about it, and I got this not only from my own observations, but from talking to these people who had seen the hard version. Under communism, it was more like George Orwell's 1984. The lies, the regime of lies was top down, and it was enforced by a threat of violence. We don't have that. So a lot of people in the West think that, well, how can you call this totalitarianism? Where are the gulags? Where are the bread lines? But that doesn't mean it's not totalitarianism. A totalitarian regime is one in which there is only one approved way to believe and to talk. And if you get outside that, you can lose your job, you can have your business taken away, you can be denounced, and all the things that we've seen, right, over the past 10, 15 years. But what totalitarianism in essence does is it tries to control your mind. It's different from authoritarianism, which is when one party or one ideology controls the political sphere, but doesn't mess with other aspects of life. Totalitarianism is authoritarianism taken to all aspects of reality. So in a totalitarian government, you may not need secret police to enforce the rules if people enforce it on themselves. And that's more of what we've been living with. I'll give you an example. I was traveling through Budapest in 2019. I was over there interviewing Hungarians who had gone to prison under communism. My translator was a young Hungarian woman, a Catholic. And we were on a tram going from interview to interview, and she said, Rod, I really struggle to talk to my Catholic friends about the struggles I have as a wife and a mother. If I tell them my husband and I have been arguing lately, they cut me off and say, oh, you've got to get a divorce. You've got to be happy. She said, I tell them, okay, but I am basically happy, but a happy life is not one without friction, without struggle, but they don't get it. I said, Anna, it sounds like you're fighting for your right to be unhappy. She said, "That's it. Where did you get that?" Chapter 17 from Huxley's Brave New World. And in that chapter, John the Savage, the only dissident in this dystopia, is brought before Mustafa Mond, the world controller for Europe. And Mond doesn't want to torture him and make him accept the dystopia. He just wants to know, why wouldn't you join us? We give you everything you want. We take care of you. We give you happy pills, soma. You can have all the sex you want, all the entertainment, et cetera, et cetera. He calls it Christianity without tears. And John the Savage, who has been raised outside this society, reading nothing but the collected works of William Shakespeare, he says, that's the problem with you people. You need a few more tears in this society. And what he goes on to say, John, is that to be fully human, to be a free human being, is to have to contend with suffering, with struggle. And Mond doesn't get it. He's like, but everybody loves comfort. And Mond says to John, it sounds like you're fighting for your right to be unhappy. And John the Savage says, I am, and I'm fighting for God, and I'm fighting for music and art and sin, basically all the things that make up a fully human life. Well, Mustafa sends him away by saying, you're welcome to it. Now, why does that matter to what my Hungarian friend said? Because we have created a society in which it's a therapeutic kind of totalitarianism, where people are so afraid of losing status, of losing their comforts, that they will accept anything, any violation of their liberty, any sense of oppression for the sake of continuing to be part of the system, keeping their job, making sure their kids go to an Ivy League school, and so on and so forth. That's the soft totalitarianism. It's not Orwell's 1984. It's more like Huxley's Brave New World.
And it's an important distinction to make when we talk about soft totalitarian versus hard totalitarianism, because, as you said, the role suffering plays in dissent changes. So you gave an example of the greengrocer, Pavlov's
greengrocer.
The parable. Takes down the sign, and he suffers immensely for it. In a society where hard totalitarianism is the method of control, if you have a populace that is accepting of their suffering, right? It's a very Augustinian point. If they accept suffering and acknowledge the reality of suffering in this world, then you can have broad-based dissent, which then causes the pain and suffering that the regime enacts basically lead to its death. Right. Soft totalitarianism works a little differently, right? It's Baconian. It's Fahrenheit 451. It is not as reliant on pain inflicted from the top. It's not to belittle it. It's real pain.
It can happen, yeah.
It's real pain, and it can happen. But it seems like being content with suffering in kind of this decentralized, softer totalitarianism, and I know it sounds like an oxymoron, decentralized totalitarianism, but that poses a real challenge for dissent in a soft totalitarian society, because all of a sudden, the thing doesn't just come crumbling down when people say, I'm not going to let you push me around anymore. How do you go about dissent and take up this suffering in a soft totalitarian society?
Well, there's no clear formula, and that's one of the things that I found really interesting about talking to the different people in Eastern Europe. It all depends on context, right? And I think one thing that you can do is refuse to work for a company, for example, or to seek a job where you're going to have to compromise your conscience. But it's difficult. When I was in Poland doing interviews for this back in 2019, I met with two early middle-aged Polish Catholics, and they said, sir, we need your advice. They were both working for the Polish outlet of an American multinational. And they said, we have been told by our boss that we must celebrate LGBT. They said, we don't have any problem with our LGBT co-workers, but we're Catholics, and we can't affirm this without violating our conscience. The problem is jobs are hard to come by, and these are good jobs. They had families. What should we do? Well, what I told them, I said, look, I can't tell you what to do, because tomorrow I'm going to get back on a plane and go back to America to a safe job working for the American conservative. But what I would tell you to do is don't say, oh, I just have to suck it up. Go talk to your priest. Talk to men and women in your life who are wise, and especially those who had gone through communism, and ask them, what is the prudent thing to do? We can't go out every time we get the least little bit of trouble and make a tough stand. We have to be prudent. But if there's no line where you will not surrender your job or your position in society for the sake of the truth, then you're already captured. I one of the movies I really like the most is called A Hidden Life by about Franz Jägerstätter. He was an Austrian farmer in the 1930s, living in a Catholic village. Everybody went to church there. But when the Nazis came, almost everybody in town became a Nazi, except for Franz and his family. And he couldn't do it because he was a Catholic. But then everybody in town was a Catholic. What was it about Franz that gave him the courage to say, I will not submit to these lies? And eventually, as you know, Franz was murdered by the Nazis, and his cause for canonization is up in the Vatican now. But he was murdered by the Nazis because he would not submit to Hitler, to swear allegiance to Hitler. Well, there's a scene in the film, and it's probably fictional. In fact, I think Terrence Malick, the writer-director, got it from Kierkegaard. But Franz goes into his village church, and there's a painter high up on a scaffolding, and he's painting pictures of the Bible, like scenes from the Gospels, things like that. And Franz admires it. The old artist says, yes, everybody comes in and admires these paintings. They admire Jesus so much. What a good man he was. But Jesus did not come, said the painter. Jesus did not come to call admirers. He came to call disciples. And you can only tell the difference between an admirer and a disciple when it comes time to suffer. That's when the rubber meets the road. And I think that's a good principle, whether we're talking about religion or not. Do we admire the truth, or do we believe in the truth? Do we want to live by the truth? And that you can only tell the difference when we have to make a decision. What are we willing to lose and to endure for the sake of the truth?
And as you said, this book came out in 2020, where it was only the beginning of we'll make this a little lower, but it was only the beginning of 4 years of suffering under the Biden administration. And in a weird way, that suffering really turned people against, the Great Awakening. It turned people against DEI. It turned people against trans nonsense. It really, people have talked about it as a paradigm shift, a vibe shift. It really does seem like America has turned, in some respects, away from those issues, whereas transgenderism, let's think of the before years in 2019, 2021. I mean, it was scary to be a private person and come out publicly against trans men going into girls' bathrooms, or trans men competing in women's sports. That was a terrifying position to have, and all of a sudden we wake up, it's 2025, and it feels like Trump and a lot of folks on the right are on the 80 side of an 80-20 issue. Mm-hmm. How did this shift occur? Is this the populace bucking this soft totalitarianism? Is that soft totalitarianism still percolating in our society? How does it?
Oh, that's really the question right now. Yeah. I remember when in 2015 we had the Obergefell decision legalizing same-sex marriage. I was invited to Capitol Hill to give a talk to a Christian group on the Hill of aides, legislative aides. They wanted to hear about my Benedict option idea. The book, The Benedict Option, had not yet been published, but I'd been writing about it in TAC. And after the talk I gave, I was invited to a private luncheon with key Republican staffers from the House and the Senate, all Christians, right? And I said to them, okay, so we lost to Obergefell. That was a big loss for our side. So what is the Republican Congress planning to do to protect religious liberty? Silence. I repeated what I had to say. More silence. Finally, one of the senior aides said, well, it's not on our agenda this fall. I left that meeting with a chill going down my spine because I realized that my people, the social and religious conservatives, we'd been sold out by the Republicans because the Republican institutionalists were terrified of being called bigots and probably terrified of getting on the wrong side of the donor class. And I thought that we're sunk, we're done. And then along came Donald Trump the next year. Now, Trump didn't do as much as he should have done in his first term, but I think he's clearly learned from his failures there. But what this taught me is that the totalitarian instinct, it depends on the cowardice of people who know better, of the fear of, say, Republican congressmen back in those days to be on the controversial side of an issue, to be called bigots by the media. And it was incredible. There was such a lack of courage. Trump showed this courage. No doubt because he's a big outsider and he didn't feel like he had anything to lose. So, but I remember thinking back then, Bradley, that, okay, the trans thing is bad, but when they start coming for the kids, that's when you're going to see Americans in the streets. You're going to see the churches rise up and so on and so forth. Didn't happen. Why didn't it happen? Because I think so many American conservatives, I'm talking about my people, and religious conservatives are so desperately afraid to be thought of as troublemakers, to be thought of as bigots and all that. The cowardice that I saw in Republican congressmen back in those days was also mirrored in a lot of our clergy and a lot of ordinary Christian conservatives like me. Mm-hmm. Well, so when Trump comes along, and by the way, when Biden comes in, it accelerates under the summer of Floyd and COVID.
And there's a weird thing, too. It even started happening before then, too, right? Trump comes in, he shows this courage. He wins unexpectedly to the ruling class.
Yeah.
You talk to people across Heartland America, they go, of course he was going to win.
Yeah.
Nevertheless, whether it was Russiagate or it was NGOs, everything that they could possibly do to pressure Trump supporters, to pressure Trump administration, right? They pulled out all the stops. Google, for example, right, trying to censor certain conservative news outlets or information.
They fired James Damore, remember that?
Right, they fired James Damore for sending a memo saying, hey, if you want more women to work at Google, maybe give them options that fit with motherhood, employment options that fit with, right, just the most absurd things. Trump showed the courage. Their first instinct was to double down.
Right.
That was, I think, not surprising to anyone. The first crack in the facade, or the first crack, they were going to try to fill as soon as it arose. Mm-hmm. Nevertheless, Joe Biden comes in and he ends up becoming president of the United States. There's this lag time between where Trump was, or where some of these courageous people standing up in the breach beforehand. You're actually one of those people to stand up to all this stuff before it was cool to do so. And Joe Biden wins. It accelerates, as you said, and then we end up in a place where people kind of catch up. The lag time. Sure. The lag time isn't there anymore.
Well, I should say, too, one thing I forgot to mention earlier, and this was a massive factor. The Obergefell ruling and everything that was around then was the first time that big business took a side in the culture war in a dramatic way. You might remember that just before Obergefell, the state of Indiana, governed at the time by Mike Pence, passed a state version of the federal Religious Freedom Restoration Act that would have given religious people who are sued for discrimination a positive defense in court against the claims. It wouldn't guarantee that they would win, but it would make things a little more even. A number of states had passed this, but for some reason, when Indiana did it, a red state, big business, Apple Computers, Salesforce, Eli Lilly, so many of the major corporate names openly came out and said, if you don't repeal this law, there will be major economic consequences. The Republicans and Governor Pence capitulated. A week later, the then governor of Arkansas said he was going to veto this if their state decided to do it, because Walmart cleared its throat and he saluted, right? And so this was the fact that big business got involved with the Great Awakening. That was the Waterloo for social conservatives. Mm-hmm. And we were sunk until Trump. And I think, too, though, that COVID was a radicalizer when people began to see what the government was capable of, and what not only the government, but a corrupt and captured medical system, many of the churches, many institutions were all in on the COVID scam. And the media too, right? it really woke people up. And the summer of Floyd. We all remember the CNN reporter with the city rioters burning the city behind him and him saying, these were mostly peaceful protests.
Right.
What happened there was a complete, I don't want to say complete, but a widespread loss of faith in the official narrative. And that brings us to Trump, right? And I think that's why when he came in, he had, whatever else he had a mandate to stop wokeness. Now, I think this is a great thing, but I think it would be a huge mistake for conservatives to think, oh, that's gone. We don't have to deal with that anymore. The Great Awakening is primarily a ruling class thing. By ruling class, I mean not just people in government, but people within every authoritative institution in society, even the military. Bradley, you probably had these conversations too with people serving in the military over the last 10 years who have just said, you can't believe what's happening, how they're hurting readiness by advancing people according to political, ideological standards. Trump is going down against that. Thank God, may he continue to do so. But this ideology is so deep inside the hearts and minds of the elites, and I don't think we can cease to be vigilant. Besides which, the tendency to believe in lies, it's not just a left-wing tendency, it's in all humans. Solzhenitsyn said the most important lesson he learned in the Gulag was that the line between good and evil does not pass between political parties or social classes or anything like that, but right down the middle of every human heart. So we shouldn't get too cocky on the right because it's not just a left-wing thing, believing in lies.
Yeah, when people started standing up to all of this, it was always a grassroots, community-oriented uprising that delivered Trump the mandate. I think a lot of people on the president's team and in the White House understand that. And it had to manifest politically because that was really the only avenue available, right? So if institutional capture is widespread, as conservatives say, tend to believe it, right? Yep. Academia is captured, media is captured, business is captured.
Law.
Medicine is captured, law is captured, all of it's captured. The only starting point, right, that you have to redress of these grievances is the political process.
That's right.
And so you start with Trump winning in 2016, and everyone doesn't believe it. And they double down on all the things that got Trump elected during his presidency and during the presidency of Joe Biden. And so I don't think it's surprising at all that the grassroots got even more invigorated and decided to deliver Trump this mandate in the second go-around, right, in 2024. But it brings up an important question about why the United States is heading in this direction, whereas other countries on the European continent are friends, right? Are bearers of Western civilization, are allies. They don't seem to be in the same place at all, and you spend a lot of time across the planet.
Right, I live
Why
there.
is Why is that?
Well, Hungary, where I live in Budapest, is the great outlier there, and it's so fascinating. I've been living in Hungary the last 4 years, in part because I got interested in Eastern Europe because of working on this book, but also because I'm fascinated by Viktor Orban and what he has done. Now, Orban is a devil, a demon as far as a European ruling class is concerned, and also the American ruling class. I mean, we just, I've lived over there during the Biden administration, and our diplomat, our ambassador there was an out married gay man who never missed an opportunity to denounce our own NATO ally for all of its backwardness, right? But Orban figured out early on that he came to power in 2010. He figured out how power actually works. It's not just politics. It's in the institutions, the NGOs, the universities. He was on to George Soros long before we were, and he saw how this was working under the guise of liberalism. Now, in our country—
I remember you used to bring George Soros up at any point in time, and you would say, people would call you, oh, you're just like Viktor Orban, you're an anti-Semitic piece of garbage. Well, now it seems like the scales have fallen off everybody's eyes, and we can talk freely about George Soros funneling money to leftist NGOs to fundamentally change the country without being called an anti-Semite. It's a completely different scenario.
That's right, because, it was such a canard calling Orban an anti-Semite. I was in Budapest summer of 2021. There was some big fight between the Israelis and Hamas at the time, and anti-Semitic riots broke out all over Europe. And in those days, I had to walk through the former Jewish quarter in Budapest to get to my office. I was worried, like, oh God, what am I going to have to take the long way around? Will there be police everywhere, military?
Are they going to attack that beautiful synagogue? Yeah.
Nothing. I was able to walk through there. You would see Jewish families, like ultra-Orthodox Jews, clearly Jewish, out walking their kids. It was fine. Budapest was the safest and is the safest big city for Jews in Europe. Budapest, which is ruled by this horrible anti-Semite Viktor Orban. So you began to see the lie, right? And I've noticed this over the last 4 years. Whenever you would have, we get people from the UK or Western Europe or even from Washington who'll come to Budapest, first day or two, they're like, this isn't what I thought. It's a totally normal society. It reminds me of like Omaha in 1995, but with better architecture and food. And then you get Europeans after a couple more days who will say, this is what Europe felt like 30 years ago, meaning before mass migration. In any case, Orban, and I've been trying for the last 3 or 4 years to get American conservatives to pay attention to what he's done. He knew that the only power to resist the Great Awakening and institutional capture was through politics. And he was a democratically elected leader. And so he's gone after these institutions in the same way that Trump is doing now. I like to think that Trump learned from Orban. Now, is Viktor Orban a great savior? No, he's a politician, but he's a smart guy who understood that all of the Brussels and the leaders of European countries and in Washington called him out as an illiberal because that was the way they covered for their own radical left-wing illiberalism. So what's happening now? It's incredible, Bradley, living over there as I do and seeing what's happening in the continent and also reading American news media. The American people don't understand how fragile Europe is socially. I was just in France before I came to the U.S. to promote the Live Not By Lies movie. I was there on a book tour, and so many French people are talking about civil war coming. And they don't mean army against army. They mean like Muslims and migrants in the suburbs of the major cities versus ordinary French people. And the governments are desperate, not only in France, but all over Europe, in the UK, to suppress this. I spoke to a man, a European lawyer, who's very well informed in England recently. He's from the continent, but he does a lot of work in England. And he said every single security service in the UK and across Western Europe is terrified of civil war. And so they're going great guns to suppress any dissent, to suppress anybody noticing that there's a two-tier justice system in a lot of these countries, not just England, where if you're Muslim, if you're a migrant, you get kid gloves treatment, but if you're a native-born person, they come down hard on you. These lies are being told and being pushed very hard by the governments in Europe to avoid having to deal with their own problems. J.D. Vance got it perfect when he went to the Munich Security Conference earlier this year and told them, he said, your greatest enemy is not Russia. Your greatest enemy is internal. You're not dealing with your own problems, primarily with the rise of Islam and migrant crime and so forth. And you're trying to silence people who pointed out, this is not going to end well for you. Last year, 2024, Ursula von der Leyen, who's the head of the European Commission, she's the closest thing that the federal superstructure has to a president, she went to Davos and gave a speech in which she said, the greatest national security threat we have in Europe is disinformation. Really? And what she means is we have to control the narrative to keep the bad people from coming to power. So at the end of last year, we all saw in Romania, the wrong guy got elected, a populist got elected. Well, the European, the EU, and the Washington worked to get the election results thrown out. You had a former commissioner, EU commissioner, who's one of the top people there, Thierry Breton, went on TV in France and said openly, we, meaning the EU bureaucracy, we handled that election and we'll do it in Germany too if we have to, if the Germans vote the wrong way. As you and I are sitting here talking this morning, Marine Le Pen, the leader of the National Rally in France, the most popular political party, the so-called far-right leader, she's just been convicted of corruption charges and banned from running for the presidency in 2027, a presidency she was likely to win. And it's just outrageous. Most people in France know that this was a political trial, like what they tried to do to Donald Trump. This is how far the European establishment is willing to go to keep their structure of lies intact. It's not going to go well for them.
Well, and it's amazing to me that our entire conversation has basically been predicated on what happens when the institutions double down. It seems like to me, every single time they've doubled down, it hasn't worked out well for them. Nevertheless, they sit here apparently freaked out about the possibility of civil war, whether that's in the UK or France or Germany or any of these other European countries. And they do the exact same thing. They double down. It seems like it's a surefire way to actually make that happen, no?
Funny you say that. About a month ago, a professor at the King's College London War Studies Department, a guy named David Betts, gave this blockbuster interview to the British podcaster Louise Perry, in which he talked very soberly about what he believes is an unavoidable coming civil war, not only in Britain, but in Western European countries. What's so chilling about it is how calm he was. This is his area of expertise. And he talked about how the British people have been disenfranchised. They've been displaced by migrants, and their government's always taken the side of migrants. And there are a million other things. But he said, the thing that's crazy is, says Betts, our government, the British military, we have a stated doctrine about this is how civil wars start. We know this from studying other countries. And yet our government, the UK government, it's like they're following a textbook about how to spark this sort of thing.
Well, it makes you wonder if they want it, right? If they're willing to double down now when the cracks are starting to show in ways that are only going to probably bring about more conflict and potentially a civil war. I mean, it's a valid question, right?
Yeah.
Do they want it? Why would they want it?
It's bizarre. It is. I don't want to be a conspiracy theorist, but I think that they are so convinced, the ruling class, of their own righteousness that they don't even care. And maybe they don't even see what's going on. And we saw this in our country too. I remember when Trump got elected in 2016, the first time, a prominent journalist who is a sort of a liberal conservative journalist, you would know his name if I mentioned it. He's a friend of mine. He wrote to me and said, "Boy, Rod, I wish I had been listening to you when you were telling me about all the working class discontent." Because I was living in Louisiana then.
Right.
And I would just send him notes saying, "Hey, this is what people are saying. This is what people are saying." And he just didn't take it seriously because he lives in Washington and moves in elite circles. He goes, "I'll have to change." Well, he didn't change. And he's still saying today, "Man, I just don't understand." Like, well, if reality contradicts your priors, what you want to believe, then a lot of people are going to double down on it, even if they're seeing everything fall apart around them. Because the power of belief, of wanting to believe something, is immense. People will believe lies because it makes them feel secure, even if they are ultimately undermining themselves. And that's what's happening in Europe right now. We've dodged a bullet in America by electing Donald Trump. I think 4 more years of Kamala or the Biden-Kamala administration, which and this aggressive pushing of this ideology, God knows what would have happened.
And we have 3 dark versions of the future. One is a hard totalitarianism. The second is this soft totalitarianism. And the third, I guess you could just characterize it as anarchy, the civil war actually coming to pass. And maybe that civil war ends with coming of hard totalitarianism
Or
soft,
authoritarianism,
or
like a dictator, an autocrat.
Yep. So maybe the anarchy is but temporary. Nevertheless, those are kind of our 3 major buckets of negative futures. We'll talk about positive futures towards the end. But I want to take a step back to the Benedict option to continue talking about live not by lies and how we operate under each one of those systems. You often have to say people who read the Benedict option and say that it is a call to retreat are wrong. What actually is the Benedict option then? And, why are those folks wrong?
Yeah, well, the people who say it's a call to head for the hills usually are those who haven't read the book, because I'm clear in the book that I'm not calling for that. I don't think that's possible. I don't think there is an escape to be made. What I say in the Benedict option, I compare the time we're living in now to the fall of the Roman Empire in the West around the year 500. And that didn't originate with me. It originated with the philosopher Alasdair MacIntyre, who was not a Christian when he wrote that in the early 80s in his book After Virtue. His argument was simply that we have lost in the West today, in the modern West, the sort of framework of truth, of the idea of how we can relate to truth, how we can have arguments, because reasonable arguments that we can reach a resolution because we all basically agree on what truth is, or that truth does exist. That's gone now, with the passing of Christianity and all senses of external moral authority. It's over. And so now, said MacIntyre, and he said this over 40 years ago, that's why our public debates don't ever get anywhere. We just yell at each other. Well, it's gone much, much farther since MacIntyre wrote that. My argument in the book is that this order, this social order, this civilizational order is falling apart. And we can even see it with the de-Christianization of the West. I'm 58 years old. Over the course of my lifetime, especially starting in the early 90s, the decline of active Christianity has accelerated. And I take an example or the advice of the second Benedict of the Benedict option, Pope Benedict XVI, who's a real hero of mine. He talked about in 1969, when he was just a priest, that the church would decline, it would lose its power, it would lose its wealth, it would lose its status and standing, and even would lose a lot of people. But those who held on to the faith through thick and through thin, they would be a lighthouse through this new dark age, and they would be a beacon to people who would get to this post-Christian era and see all the chaos and the loneliness, and they would want to come back to the church. I think that's true. I think we are living through that and are going to live through that. So what the Benedict option is simply Christians of all kinds, Catholic, Protestant, Orthodox, choosing not to focus on building up the broader social order as we have done, but rather to focus mostly, not exclusively, but mostly on building up our own Christian communities and our parish and our schools and our families and so forth, so we can be resilient. There is no escaping this world, but when we go into the world, we have to present the true face of Christ to the world. We have to learn how to suffer the hatred of others for the sake of holding on to our faith and passing it on to the kids. So the option is not to escape, but rather to take maybe a soft stand back, a soft retreat from society, so that when we go back into society, as we must every day, we know what it means to be a Christian. And look, where I live in Europe now, it's amazing to see how the leadership class in the churches, Catholic and otherwise, are earning the contempt of ordinary Catholics and ordinary Christians, because they are saying, open the doors wide to these migrants who are coming in, and literally, in the case of one case in France, cutting the throats of a priest. When I was in France recently, it was amazing to see how much the Benedict option, how popular the book was there when it came out in 2018. I visited a traditionalist Catholic monastery in the far southwest of France, and people are moving from all over France, are buying homes in the vicinity of the monastery, because they see it as a spiritual stronghold, and they feel like something big and bad is coming, and they want to be near somewhere where the traditional Catholic faith is preserved and practiced, and they can live in community with each other.
So it seems like it's investing in parallel structures of community in your pre-existing community that is rife with modernist corruption, right? To create a distinction between the Christian society and the secular society, in order to draw people into it, which is why I wanted you to lay that out, because that is probably the number one thing misunderstood about that book. Totally. And I've had questions for you in the past, because Benedict option was how I first came in touch with your work. But obviously the subtitle of this work here, A Manual for Christian Dissidents, it seems as if live not by lies. The reason that it's a manual is if we are unsuccessful fully in creating the change we'd like to see from a strategy like the Benedict option, right? The Benedict option, we invest in these parallel structures, we create the distinction. It's so beautiful that people are naturally brought into it, and the world is right. We have returned to the Shire, et cetera, et cetera. If that doesn't happen, it seems like this is how you operate in a Benedict option way when the state is continuing to come for you and to continue to pursue you.
And look, in the Benedict option, I don't think of it as here's our foolproof solution. It's a strategy for resilience and survival.
And for your soul.
Right? For your soul. Yeah, your soul has to be the most important thing, not political power, but your soul. That said, we have to stay involved in politics to some degree to protect our right to run our institutions, our churches, our schools, and so forth. So it's not about retreat from politics, but just recalibrate what you prioritize. For example, when Live Not by Lies first came out, I was living in Baton Rouge, and a guy from my church would go. He was Orthodox, but he participated in a Bible study with other older men. He took a copy of the book. This came out September 29th, 2020. He took it to his Bible study and said, guys, a guy in my church wrote this book. It's really important that we read it. And they all said, no, we don't need to read it. Trump's going to go back in and everything will be fine. Well, A, Trump didn't go back in, but B, even if he had, it doesn't mean everything's going to be fine, because our problem is not exclusively political. The lies that are told are all throughout the society. I just read a piece by Jonathan Haidt, the professor of psychology who's done incredible work on teenage mental health and smartphones, that sort of thing. And he talks about how around 2013, teenage girls in America began to believe 3 fundamental lies about reality that came to them through Tumblr and were magnified on smartphones. They came to believe in themselves as fragile, and that any ideas or speech that they heard that made them feel uncomfortable was a form of violence. They came to believe that emotions were a reliable guide to reality. And they came to believe that society was a fight between good and evil, clearly. Now, those lies, you can see how they played out in the Great Awakening. But these aren't things that came down from a political party. They emerged from academia, but they were magnified by social media and social media platforms like Tumblr. And they had a tremendous effect on our society. So Live Not by Lies, if you think of it and you think of the Benedict option as primarily political, you're missing the point. In the Benedict option, I highlight this amazing Catholic community in Italy on the coast of the Adriatic, which is so cheerful. They're a Ben-Op community, and they started their own classical Christian school called the G.K. Chesterton School, and they all go to Mass in their normal parishes, but they have a close relationship with the traditional Benedictine monastery in Norcia, St. Benedict's hometown. And when you go there, you realize these are people who just wanted to live fully Catholic lives. They're not angry about it. They don't live in a tight enclave, but they come together around this big clubhouse that they've founded for Bible study, for celebrations, for gardening, and they invite everybody in the community who wants to come in. They say, if you come here, you have to respect the fact that we're really Catholic. We really believe this stuff. And I think that is, I'm not Catholic myself, but what an amazing community that is. Why can't Protestants have that? Why can't we or Eastern Orthodox have that? So we need to be what Pope Benedict said, we're creative minorities, realizing that as Christians and as conservative/traditionalist Christians, we are minorities in this society. But if we are going to be faithful to our baptism and faithful to what we know to be true, we're going to have to live in different ways. It's not sufficient to hold the right ideas in your head. You've got to make this concrete in your community. And Live Not by Lies, in that sense, is a follow-up to the Benedict option, because it also talks about how we must behave when we get out into this society where everything's going crazy and we might be persecuted for what we believe. And we probably will be, as some Christians have been. In the movie Live Not by Lies, the very first instance we come to is a woman named Isabel Vaughan Spruce. She is a Catholic pro-life activist in England who was arrested twice for praying silently on the street near an abortion clinic. She held no sign up. She was just standing there. but the police know that she's a pro-life activist, so they arrested her for the thoughts inside her head. Now, if you're just a normie Catholic or a normie Protestant and that happens to you, you might not go back out there. You don't want trouble. But Isabel is very faithful, and she has disciplined herself as a Catholic. She's like, I have to accept it. She fought it clearly with Alliance Defending Freedom, which is such an important organization, but she was willing to risk this sort of persecution for the sake of the truth. Last point on that. In this book and also in the film, you meet this woman named Kamila Benda, or Bendova, as they would say in the Slavic countries. She's like the matriarch of the anti-communist resistance in Prague, in Czechoslovakia. She and her late husband Václav are the only Catholics in that community. Václav Havel was their leader, and there were others there, but they were the only Catholics. And the rest of them were hippies who, led pretty irregular moral lives, shall we say. And I remember standing in her apartment in Prague and said, Kamila, was this difficult for you and your husband to work with these hippies, given how radically different your religious and moral views were? She said, no, Rod, not at all. The thing you have to understand when you're dealing with totalitarianism is the most important quality to look for in allies is courage. She said, you must not have the idea that all of our fellow Catholics, or even most of them, were courageous. They wanted to keep their heads down like everybody else to avoid trouble. My late husband and I felt like we could not stand before God and be silent. And the only people who would stand up with us were these hippies. And that taught me a really important lesson, how you can't just look to your own side for allies. That's why, Barry Weiss, who founded the Free Press, I first took notice of her in 2020 when she stood up and quit her job at the New York Times, even though she's a secular Jewish lesbian of the center left. She quit her job because she would not submit to this regime coming from the mob within the New York Times that wouldn't let them speak the truth. And so I became a defender of hers, and she became a proponent of Live Not by Lies. We were on a podcast once, and she said, if you had told me 2 years ago I would be on the same side as Rod Dreher on anything, I wouldn't have believed it. And I feel the same way about her.
Mm-hmm.
But this is how, talking to the people who fought communism, this is how it changed me and taught me the wisdom of making allies across political lines on the basis of shared courage and disgust over the lies that we're forced to live by.
Mm-hmm. One thing that has been written over and over and over again is the rise of barstool conservatism, or this post-religious right in the United States. People think that it's ascendant with President Trump in office. We've seen that not to be true. President Trump's religious support has continued to increase. Republican support amongst religious communities has continued to increase. Nevertheless, there is a real decline in religiosity. We talk about it all the time on this show. We talk about it all the time in your writing, in my writing, everywhere. We're talking about this decline in religiosity. It's a really big challenge for the country moving forward, because what happens when politics becomes even more unmoored from religion?
Right.
Why is it a manual for Christian dissidents? Why is Christianity the secret sauce in this effort to revitalize our civilization?
Yeah, well, as a conservative and as a writer, I'm much more concerned about the survival of Christianity than I am with the survival of liberal democracy or the Constitution. It's not that I don't care about those things. It's just that the faith, that's everything for me. And I wrote this as a Christian writer, speaking to other Christians, because I saw among our own tribe, a real lack of awareness of what's going on, right? But if we don't hold on to Christianity in Western civilization, we're done. Because as the writer Tom Holland, the English historian, found when he worked on his book Dominion, his great history Dominion, almost all of the things that he valued as a secular liberal, he found came out of Christianity. It was the grounding for Western civilization. And that's why I think you have people like Ayaan Hirsi Ali, famously an atheist. She's become a Christian in part because she began to realize that all the things that I ran to the West out of an Islamic totalitarianism for came ultimately out of Christianity.
They weren't Enlightenment ideas.
No.
Yep.
The Enlightenment was a secularized form of Christianity. And this is what Alistair McIntyre saw, too. The Enlightenment tried to establish, on the basis of reason alone, a way to keep these ideals present in society, and it failed. We're not going to be able to get through this without a return, ultimately, to Christianity. My newest book, which came out last fall, it's called Living in Wonder, and it is purely religious. There's nothing political about it, but where I'm talking about the crying need to return to a sense of transcendence, to infuse our own churches, our own religious lives with this sort of thing, because the West is re-enchanting itself, whether we like it or not, but it's doing it on non-Christian bases in many cases. I'll give you an example. I was in Oxford 2 years ago at a conference, and during the break, a young man came up to me, a guy named Daniel Kim, 27 years old. He is a seminarian, an evangelical Anglican studying in Oxford, and he said, I got to tell you, I know you're working on this enchantment book. Your generation thinks that atheism is the big challenge, and that's not true for my generation, not at all. We're not interested in atheism. I said, so what is the big challenge? He
Spirituality.
said, the occult.
Yeah.
Soft forms and hard forms. He told me that before he went to seminary, he worked for a major company in London. He said, I was the only Christian in my office. That's no surprise. But he said there were no atheists. Every other person there was involved in some form of the occult, whether something as soft as tarot cards or astrology. There were even 2 open Satanists who defined Satanism as learning how to live out your human nature to its fullest extent. And he went on to tell me, I know that when I'm ordained, I'm going to be spending the rest of my life dealing with this. But your generation, Rod, you have no idea it's coming or it's even here. Well, after it really shook me up, and I went and did some social science research after that. He's right. I was just in Nashville before I came here and was talking to people there, Christians, evangelicals, who said that the soft occult is all over Christian circles, almost always women, getting into tarot cards, various forms of it. But if you've talked to any exorcist, as I did, my book has interviews with exorcists, they'll tell you it's a gateway. Now, people today don't think they can find any sense of real transcendence and mystery in the churches. And they're right to a certain extent. We have made Christianity so moralistic and even political in some cases, but our churches by and large are not speaking to people's deep hunger for mystery and transcendence. At least in the Catholic and Orthodox churches, which are the ones I know, I don't know a lot about Protestantism, it's all there, but our leaders don't want to talk about it. I think that maybe it's a boomer thing. They want so badly, to kick out things that they see as superstitious. But the impact of this is, like in America now, the Catholic Church cannot make enough exorcists to deal with the problems that they're struggling with. I quote in my new book, Living in Wonder, an exorcist who works in the Vatican, who said that the truth of the matter is wherever Christianity recedes, darkness goes in. There's no such thing as a neutral, secular public space, a spiritual vacuum. So this is all part of the same story I'm trying to tell in the Benedict option, Live Not by Lies and Living in Wonder. It's all about Christian resistance and resilience. And if we can manage to keep the faith strong and draw people back to it over time, probably not in my lifetime, maybe not in yours, but we have to take the long game, then we can save our civilization. But if not, then we better prepare to swear allegiance to the imam or to AI.
Yeah, and it's funny reading reviews of Live Not by Lies, because it says it's not as optimistic as the Benedict option, but it is more hopeful. It's like, just again, don't know how familiar these book reviewers are with the works of St. Augustine.
Yeah.
But yep, it's St. Augustine over and over and over again. Why is this hopeful, but not necessarily optimistic?
Oh, thank you for asking that question. I get this all the time because in our country, especially in church circles, we think hope and optimism are the same thing. They're not.
Which is part of the transcendence question.
Right. I had a conversation back in 2018 when I was in France promoting the French edition of the Benedict option. I was with Alain Finkielkraut, who is just a very brave man, one of the top French intellectuals, secular Jew. He was one of the soixante-huitards, the 60s radicals, but he got very disillusioned with it. And he's now considered almost reactionary on the French scene. But I really respect his courage in speaking out against Islamic radicalism and so forth. So we had coffee, and we talked about the decline of the West and how we both love Michel Houellebecq, the French dystopian French novelist. He's got a really accurate read on the malaise in the West. So at the end of our conversation, I said, Mr. Finkelkraut, where do you find hope? And he looks at me and he just shrugs, a Gallic shrug, and said, I have no hope. He didn't say it in a dramatic way, just sort of, I'm done. And I said, well, I do have hope, and my hope is in Jesus Christ. But please don't think I'm saying that to you like a TV evangelist. I'm not an optimist. I think things are going to get a lot worse before they get better. But my hope comes from the fact that my faith teaches me that even if you suffer and unite your sufferings to Christ, that God will redeem it. Good will come out of it in the end. We don't do a cost-benefit analysis. We suffer because our Lord suffered for the truth, and he was resurrected. Well, he listened to me, Finkelkraut did, a secular Jew, respectfully, and he said, well, that's good for you Americans, but here in France, we don't believe in God. And that was the end of the conversation. And I realized that poor man, no wonder he has no hope. There's no reason to have to be optimistic about France, but he doesn't have any metaphysics or any religion to give meaning to his suffering. And that's what it comes down to. Bradley, not one of these people I talked to in the Eastern Bloc thought they were going to live to see the end of communism. Some of them told me we thought it would last hundreds of years. Of course, they all did. But they did what they did. They suffered what they suffered. They took up the cause that they did because they believed it was right and true, and they had to be accountable to Almighty God and for their actions. That's why they're so inspirational, and that's where the hope comes. It's not optimistic. We have lots of fights ahead of us, but if we don't have that metaphysical hope, that hope that comes from knowing that our suffering has meaning, then we're lost.
Right, and it makes hope and knowledge that suffering means something, has a divine meaning, makes all those fights to get to the optimistic future a lot easier to swallow.
Right. Were the martyrs optimists?
Right.
No, but they died because they were full of hope. They knew that if they suffered and even gave their own lives for the sake of testifying to Jesus Christ, the truth of Jesus Christ, that God would reward them in the next life. And maybe, this is maybe an extreme version of what Václav Havel and Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn were saying about being willing to suffer for the truth. You change people's hearts because people can't bear people who have any sort of human consciousness left don't want to be cowards. And when enough people start standing up, that can change everything. I mean, look at what Martin Luther King did. The men of the civil rights movement, they knew that they had no way to win by force of arms to turn back segregation. So they accepted suffering for the sake of the cause, and they suffered terribly. Some of them gave their own lives, but it finally moved people to move the consciences of those who had the power to change things, and it worked. I mean, I think there's a really powerful lesson to be learned from our own history there.
Yeah. A story of finding meaning in suffering is now becoming a docu-series. What can we expect from this docu-series? It is premiering as we speak, essentially.
As we speak, yeah.
We are recording this before the first episode releases tomorrow, April 1st. But this episode will be released a little bit later. So if you are interested in watching it, go check it out right now. But what can viewers expect from this project? You've given us a little taste with some anecdotes.
Yeah, well, it's coming out from Angel Studios. They did The Chosen and an amazing platform. You can go to angel.com and sign up. It's a subscription-only thing. There will be a new hour-long episode in each Tuesday in the month of April, and it will remain on that platform for a while. What we did, I took the camera crew around and introduced them to some of the people from the book. There's Camilla Bendova. We're there in her apartment, and we even go down into a hidden chamber where the underground Catholic Church in Slovakia for 10 years toward the end of communism produced samizdat, illegal literature that kept the life of the church going. what was incredible about that, not only is it so secretive, you have to go through a trap door and under a tunnel in a normal house in Bratislava, and you come up in this little room where there's an offset printer there that they still have it there that produced all this material for the life of the Catholic Church. What was special, too, is that offset printer was sent to the Catholics by Open Doors, an evangelical ministry based in the Netherlands that served the underground churches under communism. They smuggled that in, the Protestants did, piece by piece to the Catholics, and then the Protestants sent another team in to rebuild it so the underground Catholic Church could survive. To me, that is the most beautiful example of ecumenism, real ecumenism that I can think of. Because one thing I learned talking to these different people, when Christians were thrown into communist prisons, they knew there that they weren't in prison because they were Catholic, because they were Protestant, because they were Orthodox. They knew they were there because they were followers of Jesus Christ. So they helped each other. They prayed together. And that's what I think we have to do today. In any case, you get to see these things that I write about in the book. You get to hear the voices of these people and see their faces and their stories in the documentary that aren't in the book. The cumulative effect, Bradley, is to put a human face on what actually happened, and not only a human face on it, but to tell people about it in the first place. If you go on Netflix now, you can find 100 documentaries about Hitler and the Nazis, and that's great. We need to know what happened there so it doesn't happen again. There's almost nothing about communism. It has been memory holed. I quote in the book a young woman in California, and Live Not by Lies, I don't give her name, 26 years old, told me, I'm a communist. Oh, why? Well, peace, brotherhood of man, equality, and all that. I said, okay, so what about the gulags? The what? She had no idea. Now, I know for a fact she had been raised because she was the daughter of friends of mine, she had been raised in a conservative Christian home, but she was born after the end of the Cold War and had no idea. Nobody ever told her what communism was. And this is not her fault. This is our fault. This is the fault of the boomers and the Xers and those who controlled the culture who never told these stories, who even us conservatives, we just said, oh, we defeated the Soviet Union, communism is over, let's go on. And we're shocked that the young generation that has never been taught these stories of what actually happened are suddenly falling for the same old lies again. I'm hoping this documentary and my book, but also the documentary, will wake up people now, young people especially, and tell them this really happened and this is happening again. And history doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme. And it's happening again right here, right now. We had an advanced screening in Birmingham at Samford University, and some of those students who saw it were like, I never knew. This is incredible. Well, we're just bringing history to them. History that is not just dry facts and events of the past, but history that has direct bearing on the lives they're living today. These men and women, these heroes, these saints of the communist era are dying out now. They're very old. When they're gone, they're gone. We have to listen to them now while there's still time.
Live not by lies. A simple mantra that everyone should live by, right?
That's right.
Rod, where can people find your work?
Well, I write a daily Substack, Rod Dreher's Diary. It's at roddreher.substack.com. I write every single weekday, sometimes on the weekends. I'm on Twitter at Rod Dreher. I write for the Danube Institute in Budapest, center-right think tank there. And, it seems like I'm always writing. Right?
You are always writing. You are prolific in that regard. And now you're going to be always filming, I guess.
Well, yeah, we had. They told me the Harmon brothers who run Angel Studios said that they had never had any project they've ever done that had a higher rating from inside the Angel Guild, like their mass group that the
crowdfunding mechanism, right?
They've never had a higher rating for any project than on Live Not by Lies. So now there's discussion about if this does well, doing a second season. This time, I would like to focus on people from China. Right? Mm-hmm. And from Vietnam and what they had to live with, or maybe from Latin America, from Cuba, Venezuela, and so forth. Communism is not just a European thing, and it is in fact more powerful today in China now that it has found a way to become capitalists and capitalists, while at the same time maintaining maximum control on churches and individual liberties. So there are so many more stories to tell. If the movie is a success, we'll be doing another season and maybe 2 more seasons.
Yeah, as Deng Xiaoping once said, let go with one hand, and he was talking about the economy, and hold tight the politics of the other, which makes for a super interesting piece of art because of your focus on both the hard and soft versions of totalitarianism. Well, if that second season sounds interesting to you, make sure to check out the first one on Angel Studio. Again, every Tuesday in April, a new episode in this docu-series. Rod, friend, former colleague, thank you so much for coming on the Signal Sitdown.
Thanks for having me on. This is so important, and I appreciate you giving this message and the message of these brave men and women from behind the communist bloc a voice.
Of course, Rod Dreher. Thank you.
Thank you so much for tuning into the Signal Sitdown. Before you go, be sure to hit like and subscribe on YouTube, Spotify, or wherever you may be joining us. And please remember to give us a 5-star review. We not only love your feedback, but it really does help the show. Remember, it's your government, and together we'll expose how it really works. See you next time.